Before I get into the animation, I want to talk a bit about staging and basically knowing how to use your camera, because it's easy to overlook the significance of it, especially in 3D. This will be a little less technical and more theory-based than the last video. So you don't want to just throw a camera down somewhere. The idea here is you want to treat your camera as a tool. How and where you place your camera can have a vast impact on how your story and your characters are perceived. To go over some basic shots, first you have your establishing shot or your extreme ultra-wide shot. Because this is such a pulled back shot, it can be used to display a certain setting, often at the beginning to let the audience know where we are, but it can also be used for other things. You can see that the character is really small and there's a lot of negative space around him, which could be used to show the insignificance of the character against the environment, or maybe another character like a giant monster or something. Next is a wide shot. It's a lot closer, so we don't see as much of the environment, but we see more of the character. And since his whole body is still visible, we can use it to show something that involves his whole body. So he could be walking, running, jumping, falling, anything that requires us to see him as a whole. Then we have a medium shot, which cuts off roughly around the hips. Half the body is visible, so there's still some room for movement, particularly with the arms, and we also see the expressions on his face a bit more clearly. After that is a close-up, which brings you really close to the character and puts the emphasis on the expression or reaction to show how the character's feeling. It can also be used to deliberately hide all the other elements in your scene. And lastly, there's the extreme close-up, which puts all the focus on a specific detail, which pretty much can be anything you want. Since you don't see too much of what's going on around that detail, it can be used to merely suggest the action or intent of whatever's going on. This is a pretty interesting technique because you don't always have to explicitly show everything that's going on. You can just show bits and pieces and let people use their imagination to fill in the gaps. And you don't always have to use an extreme close-up for this either, you can be creative with it. It's not really about the shot itself, it's how you use the shot in the context of everything else that will really make the difference. Now so far all the shots have been at roughly eye level, which makes us equal with the character. However, if we were to move the camera up and tilt it down, this puts us above the character and makes him look less significant. If we move the camera down and tilt it up, now we're below the character, making him more significant. So this is just another thing you can play around with to create different effects. Once you choose your shot, you have to choose where you're going to arrange everything. A common way is to use the rule of thirds, and if you go into the camera settings, you can turn on thirds in composition guides, which makes things a bit easier. The last big thing you want to consider during staging is foreground, middle ground, and background. If you want to create some depth in your shot, avoid putting things on the same level, which tends to flatten the image. Again, it depends on what you want to achieve exactly, but by varying the distance between the camera and the elements in your scene, it'll make the scene feel a little more dynamic. Now, once you have your camera set up, if you want to switch between them, select your camera, then add a marker in the timeline. Choose Bind Camera to Markers, then go to where you want the switch to happen, add another marker, and bind your next camera to that marker. The next big thing I want to talk about is camera movement. When it comes to camera movement in 3D, it's easy to get carried away because of how relatively simple it is to achieve. A lot of beginners like to make the camera fly all over the place, and it's not always necessary. Think of why you're adding a camera move if you are, and what it'll add to the shot. Now, just like before, there's different types of camera moves that you can use, and each one will have a different impact on your shot and your story. Firstly, you have your pan and your tilt. I mentioned tilt before, which is when you rotate the camera up or down, and pan is when you rotate it from side to side. For both, the camera stays put, it doesn't actually move, and this creates sort of an observer effect, like you're turning your head and looking around the scene to see what's there. It can also be used to keep a moving character in frame or to accentuate that movement. Then you have your dolly, truck, and pedestal shots. This is where the camera actually moves its position. Dolly moves in and out, truck moves side to side, and pedestal, or crane shot, moves up and down. These can be used in a similar way to the pan and tilt, but to create a more three-dimensional effect. This one isn't a camera move, but if you change your focal length in the camera settings, you can zoom in and out. If you combine everything, you can get some interesting shots. Now sometimes it can get tricky to do these kinds of shots, or to at least get pleasing results out of them, because of how much movement is going on. So a way that you can simplify it is to parent your camera onto other objects, rather than dealing with it alone. So for example, if you parent your camera to an empty, then move the camera away, and rotate the empty, it'll give the camera an orbiting effect. Then if you add another empty, parent your original empty to it and give it some movement, it gives it a dolly effect as well. If you want to fixate the camera onto somewhere, you can add one more empty, then lock the camera onto it with a track 2 constraint. And with this, you can make the camera pan or tilt as well, while making sure it points exactly where you need it to. So by breaking down the movement like this, it makes things a little easier to manage than if you were just keyframing the camera the whole way. It's also easier to go in and adjust certain things if you need to. You can also use paths, which act like tracks that your camera rides on. Just parent your camera to the path with a constraint and hit animate path. You can control its speed by going to the graph editor and changing its slope. So that's it for camera work. To summarize, I'd say just be aware of the decisions you make when you're staging your shots, and how you can use your camera to more effectively tell your story. In the next part, I'll go over my animation workflow.